So I just wanted to make this quick video while I work on some of my other projects that I mentioned in my last one, um, responding to two sort of typical objections about the nature of heaven that I've received, whether in my Curious Cat or DMs or whatever. Um, Now, they aren't exactly intellectual objections per se, but they are, I think, powerful enough to give people some degree of concern. So I thought I'd address them, partially because they present an opportunity to draw from perhaps my favorite treatise on the beatific vision that I've ever read, um, and that is by Garrigou Lagrange's Life Everlasting. I'd highly recommend that you get this book. I think it's on Amazon. Um, but yeah, just look up, Garrigou Lagrange, Life Everlasting, and you'll be able to find it. But anyway, the objections that I'm talking about are as follows. The first one being, if heaven is just the eternal worship of God, how is this not just sort of an endless exercise in pure sycophancy? And how is this remotely satisfying or perfective of my deepest desires? So that's the first one. The second one is, would not this eternal perpetuation of the same perfect state simply inevitably become mundane as a mere continuation of the same immobile experience? Doesn't this defy everything we know about human experience? Now, sure, you could say abstractly, of course, that it will be perfection, but how does this really jive with the concrete experience of our desire for novelty? As I said, these obviously aren't really intellectual objections per se, but they are questions that I get asked a lot. So, since they speak to really the ultimate purpose of Christianity as such, I think it'd be worthwhile to tackle them here. So, as to the first objection, I think this is ultimately a failure to properly conceive of the nature of God in relationship to man, or even more broadly in relationship to that which is not God. As I've sought to emphasize countless times throughout this channel, it's perhaps the gravest mistake to conceive of God as an individuated being alongside us, sort of on the same ontological plane of existence. If this were true, then the objection would, I think, actually be well-founded. God would have sort of his own restrictive nature, just like us, and our perpetual adoration of him would be received according to the ontological limitations of his restrictive nature, thereby perfecting him, and therefore taking away from us that which we would render unto him. But it's precisely because God is not an individuated subject with a restrictive nature existing alongside ours that our praise of him can simultaneously be self-emptying on our part and perfective of our nature at the deepest depths of its being. I think, as with many theological questions, a natural analogy is helpful here. A plant, in order to receive its proper fulfillment and nourishment, must yield in total surrender, if you will, to the light of the sun. It must yield itself totally to the sun, sort of bowing before it in submission, as it were, in order to receive the proper nourishment that it craves from the depths of its nature. And it can only receive this from the sun and its light. Now, for us, we are not bowing in perpetual sycophancy to a despot for his own self-perfection. We are submitting in absolute totality everything that we are to that which alone can satiate the deepest, infinite desires of our soul. Now, because God is not confined to any genus, and is therefore totally other to that which is not God, ironically, it's his radical otherness that enables him to be perfective of our being in its absolute totality, and in the deepest and most intimate ways conceivable. It is because he does not have a restrictive, quantitative nature alongside ours that it's not as though the more we render unto him, the less we have. He is the principle by which anything is more or less perfect, and for this reason, the more we render ourselves unto him, the more perfected and fulfilled we are, according to the limitations of our capacity to receive him. Any limitation, however, is going to be from our end, not from God's, and that's because he is utterly uncircumscribed in every respect. Our act of total submission and adoration does not take away from our self-perfection, but is the precise means by which we attain our perfected fulfillment. So that's kind of to tackle the first objection about heaven as eternal worship. I hope that was a little bit helpful there. As to the second objection, and this is where we're going to draw more explicitly from Garrigou-Lagrange's treatise, and that is, how does the perpetual succession of the same spiritual state of being not simply become drawn out? How can this satiation truly last throughout all of eternity when we are finite creatures ourselves? Now, this would only be true if the beatific vision consisted of an infinite collection of finite moments of satiation. In other words, if heaven was merely an unending succession of the satiating moments that we experience right now, then that would be potentially, in principle, exhaustible, because the content of each moment would be exhaustible. The fallacy of this, though, is in mapping our own finite moments of satiation onto divine satiation, in the same way that the first objection maps our individuated manner of being onto God's, but simply writ large. As Garrigou-Lagrange puts it, quote, "Heavenly joy has a newness which cannot pass away. The first instance of the beatific vision lasts forever, like an eternal morning, eternal spring, and eternal youth. It resembles the eternal beatitude of God. God's life is one unique instance of immutable eternity. He cannot grow old. He is not past or future, but eternally present. He contains eminently all successive events, as the summit of a pyramid contains all points at its base, as the view of a man placed on a mountain embraces the entire valley. Simultaneous totality, that is the definition of eternity," unquote. And he goes on to say, again, quote, "The beatific vision of the saints is measured by a unique instant of immovable eternity. The joy of that instant will never pass away. Its newness, its freshness will be eternally present. As the vision will always be new, so likewise the joy which flows from the vision," unquote. So, in other words, because the beatific vision is not merely a passive spectacle of the divine essence, but is a real participation of God's inner divine life, we will experience a real and proper sharing in that same eternal divine activity, whereby the Son is satiably loved by the Father by one everlasting act of infinite perfection. Now that infinitude transcends individuated finite moments of succession, such that heavenly satiation mirrors in a way the absolute simplicity of God himself, being absolutely undivided in a single act of bliss. Thus it is never a repetition of moments past, but an eternal recurrence of fresh bliss, mirroring the infinite vastness of the divine essence, which never ages, but subsists in a manner entirely transcendent of any shadow of temporal succession, abiding in the pure act of the infinite present. Now, we, of course, we exist, or rather in heaven we will exist, midway between time and eternity, but the bliss flowing from the beatific vision will nonetheless be a real and true participation in the eternal freshness of divine bliss. There will never be a time where one moment of the beatific vision passes and thereby loses its luster and then another begins. That sense of freshness we catch very brief glimpses, very brief and finite glimpses, I should say, of in any achievement of a perfective good in this life. That sense of freshness will simply define in its total purity the satiation of the beatific vision. Now, there's obviously a sense in which this can't be, fully captured into words, but this is just to say that because we are participating in the inner Trinitarian life of God, it will be a participation in the infinite and eternal wellspring of divine perfection, and therefore the satiation we receive from this will partake of this infinitude and eternality, one indivisibly eternal act of satiable newness that cannot even in principle grow old or repetitive. Our moments of finite satiation are repetitive because they are broken up into divisible successive moments of the same limited thing. whereas in the beatific vision, it is one indivisible act of unlimited and infinite perfective vastness, quite the opposite of vain repetition. So I highly recommend, as I said, buying the book I mentioned, as it goes into these clarifications in much more depth, way better than I can here, and of course in much more elegant words. Again, it's called Life Everlasting and the Immensity of the Soul, a theological treatise of the four last things, death, judgment, heaven, and hell, again by Garrett Lagrange. So definitely get that whenever you can. You won't be disappointed. So I hope this was somewhat helpful in clarifying these two objections, if you've had them, if you've thought about them. I know none of this is exactly groundbreaking stuff, but I do get a lot of repeats of these two objections, so I thought I would just answer them here. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, as it does help a lot. I'm going to keep uploading more content, as I said in my last video, so stay tuned for more of that. God bless.